And good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of fantastic food safety, food quality, amazing products that we all enjoy every single day. And if nobody else says it, Anna and I are going to say it to you today. Good job. You did a really good job, and we appreciate all that you do. And if you're new to the chat, welcome. Pull up a chair. This is the Food Safety Chat Live, and my name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, we go live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we talk about a food safety topic because food safety, not a point of competition. We're all in this together, and the consumers expect all of their food to be safe and healthy, and we're giving that to them, and we really like that we have it. So with that, we're kind of going to get going here pretty quick here today as well. But before we jump into stuff, one of the things that we love to do here on the chat is we put in where in the world you are at. I am in beautiful Loveland, Colorado, where it's going to be beautiful sunny day, low 80 degrees Fahrenheit, absolutely wonderful. And Elena's here. Good morning. Elena's been putting up some wonderful content. So thank you, Elena, for all that you do on that. We appreciate it. And so with us, we have a very special guest here today, Dr. Anna Craig. How are you, Anna?
Good. Thanks, Bryan.
And where in the world are you at?
I am actually very close to Elena in Arvada, so just 25 minutes from Denver in the beautiful Colorado. Weather is starting to... Oh, someone else. Weather is starting to get nice now on the 80s, and I think in a couple of weeks we'll have some fall color. So very exciting time to be here.
I definitely hope so. Yeah, it's been a warm summer for sure. And Colorado for me, Anna, is my favorite months are May and September, kind of this period of time where you can open your windows at night and your house cools down and starting to get a little darker in the morning, which is kind of a bummer, but it's nice to kind of, lay in bed a little bit longer maybe than you should. So that's always good. We have the Colorado contingency here going. It looks like so far this morning with Austin. Good morning, Austin. So with that, let's do our community toast here first. So everybody, cheers. Join us.
Cheers.
Because Anna, I am saving something very special. It is the dad joke. Are you ready for the dad joke?
Go for it.
Why did the bacteria cross the microscope? To get to the other slide. I found that one. I was very happy when I found that one. It's like, oh, cool, a micro dad joke. So you gotta love the micro dad jokes. To the other slide. Come on, what are we talking about here? Wah, wah, wah. So everybody's groaning collectively. Sorry. You get older, you like dad jokes. What can I say? So with that, Anna, gosh, we got a ton to cover here today. So I want to dive in here. Allie's here. Good morning, Allie, from rainy Raleigh today. Very nice. So to get started, one of the traditions we have here on the chat, Anna, is whenever we have a new guest on here, we want to make sure everybody's familiar with you and gets to know you a little bit. So why don't you start by telling everybody a little bit about you?
Of course. Well, first, Bryan, thanks for the invite. I'm honored to be here. And maybe folks here can tell by my accent. I am from Brazil. I am a food scientist. And I came to the US first as a visiting researcher. So back then I was working with coffee and spectroscopy for quality control. So I went to Purdue for that. And after that, I took jobs in the industry, all in food safety and quality. And what I love to do, Bryan, is to identify risks related to new ingredients, new suppliers, new processes, new products, and work with our amazing R&D, supply chain, QA teams to find solutions and ensure that products will meet food safety and regulatory standards. And a lot of meeting regulatory standards is making sure products will meet Prop 65 compliance, right? So this is a big part of my work. I look very closely on heavy metals in particular, and excited to be talking more about this with you all today.
Yeah, so, fellow patriot.
Oh.
Good to see you, Raphael. And So one of the things we hear this floating around Prop 65, and this is one of those topics I wanted to tackle here today, Anna, because it's something that floats out there on the periphery of what we do with food science. Because when we're looking at food safety plans, we're looking at our microbiological threats, which takes the forefront, really. We're looking at salmonella and listeria, and we're really focusing in on this. And sometimes we forget about the chemical and the physical threats. And with the physical side of things, right, it's always in the top 3 for risk. And on the chemical side, it kind of gets a little fuzzy. So it's like, oh gosh, what do we look at for the chemical things? And a lot of times companies get caught off guard because of this weird Prop 65 thing. And all of a sudden, lawyers contact your company and they're like, hi, we pulled some of your product from a shelf here in California. And we did some analysis of your product and you are out of compliance for Prop 65. Pay us some money. And everybody's like, what? What's going on? And if you don't understand this California regulation, you're really at risk, aren't you?
Yeah. And I think, we can start by talking about what is Prop 65 and why it can be so dangerous to business. So Prop 65 is the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act. It's a result of a ballot initiative, and it was voted by Californians in 1986.
Wow.
So it's been a while. It's been there for a while, and it's a right to know law. And basically, what it does is it requires businesses to warn consumers about the presence of certain chemicals in their products. By certain chemicals, it means any chemicals that are in the Prop 65 list, which are chemicals known to the state to cause cancer and reproductive toxicity. And it applies to pretty much anything sold in the state of California. So if you're selling food in California, this applies to you. Here we are going to be talking about food, beverage, dietary supplements, but clothing, jewelry, electronics, cosmetics, you name it, pretty much anything, right? And the most important is that Prop 65 does not ban these chemicals from being in the food. It basically requires manufacturers to warn consumers about their presence. So if the chemical is there and you have the warning on your label, you are good, okay? Mm-hmm. But if you don't, and you are found to not be in compliance, there are stiff penalties that applies to these businesses, which could be as high as $2,500 per day per violation.
Wow. And so part of this, right, is this gets into the business side of things. So number one, if you're a food company of any scale, you're going to be selling in California. So if you're selling products across the country, you're going to have to meet that highest bar relative to these standards, because you don't want to have different products for different states. That doesn't make any sense. So you should be complying with the regulations in California. And sometimes your products are being sold in California even when you don't know it, because your products go to a distributor who then sells to a company in California, and it ends up on shelves. And you end up subject to this regulation. Also relative to this is, you had mentioned, Anna, that there's a label that you can put on. And we've all seen this when you travel to California. You're in a hotel and you go and get your food and the breakfast in the morning in the hotel, and you go and there's a big sticker on the microwave that says, warning, warning, Prop 65, this can cause reproductive. And you're like, what? And then that doesn't make any sense. And you throw your food in there. So companies do not want to put a warning on their package, and that it's scaring people. So if I'm a mom living in Colorado and I pick up a food product, and it says, warning, warning, may contain chemicals dangerous to reproductive harm or things like this, you're like, ugh, and you're going to put that back down and not take that risk. So it scares people in those type of areas, doesn't it?
It is scary, and to consumers. At the same time, Bryan, I feel like in California, these warnings are just, like you said, everywhere, right? And when people start seeing warnings everywhere, they start to ignore it, right? Mm-hmm. So they don't care anymore. And reason why they are everywhere is because the limits are extremely low. And well, there is a number of chemicals in this list, right? When it was first published, there were a little over 200 chemicals listed. Now we are over 900 chemicals requiring warnings, and this number keeps increasing. So every year, the OIA will review. OIA is the California office that manages Prop 65. So every year they will review the list and add new chemicals.
Well, that's a good point for everybody to remember. Even if you have a program in place, it's not static. So you need to be constantly looking at this list of what California is concerned about under Prop 65. So there's a website here, and I'll pop this up here in the comments as well, that I found, where it lists some of these elements. So we have acrylamide, which is a dangerous chemical when you fry foods and things like this, arsenic, BPA, cadmium, lead, mercury. Those are kind of the main things that they're worried about, aren't they?
Well, in terms of Prop 65, if you look at the last 12 months, most of the notices of violation are related to heavy metals, vast majority. And last year, more than 80% of the notices of violation were for lead only. So if I were to give one advice to folks, is to test for heavy metals and know where you are related to that. But there are many other chemicals. That are over 900 chemicals in the list. Currently, heavy metals is the biggest target, but in the past, there were other chemicals that were heavily targeted as well. You mentioned acrylamide, and I think acrylamide is a good example, and I think it illustrates a little bit about how controversial Prop 65 can be. So years ago, if you were to walk to a coffee shop in California, probably you would see a warning saying that coffee can expose you to a chemical that was found by the state to cause cancer. And this chemical is acrylamide, which is, you can't produce coffee without producing acrylamide, right? And when this happened, more than 90 companies in the coffee business received notices of violation. Some of them decided to settle, but others decided to go to court and fight in court. And they were in trials for years. Finally, in 2019, the OIA took a step back and they exempt coffee from warning requirements related to acrylamide. And they only did this after reviewing more than 1,000 studies with whose IARC. IARC is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And these studies were showing that the science behind acrylamide as a hazard that could cause cancer was not settled yet. And at the same time, there were many researches being published showing that coffee as a whole could help prevent certain types of cancer.
Interesting. So this kind of overlays as well with, and you see this a lot in the European countries outside of the U.S. It's here somewhat. I think Prop 65 is an example of this, Anna, is the precautionary principle. So a lot of times what California is doing in these situations with the precautionary principle, it's like, okay, in the absence of evidence proving that this is a negative risk relative to a particular product, we will consider it to be a risk until proven otherwise. And sometimes that can really hamper things. And I think that's a really good example of this. So with the acrylamide, any type of high heat processing associated with carbohydrates is a risk for this acrylamide. And so even though they jumped the gun, they had to pull back. We've seen this in other areas as well, too. But that doesn't really help you if you're a food company, because if California says at a particular point in time when they update that list, acrylamide, you need to, right now you've got to scramble to defend yourself. And if you're a smaller company, right, you're not a big, massive food company that can, afford lawsuits. You've got to kind of wait and see how this thing all shakes out. So you're really in a kind of a limbo land, aren't you?
Yeah, and I mean, there are many chemicals there that the state has not established safe harbor levels as well. So safe harbor levels will be using this term a lot, but it refers to the limits that a product can have in terms of micrograms per day. But for many chemicals, the state has not defined limits yet. So basically, you need to be below the limit of quantification. In the case of acrylamide, yes, Bryan, this is constantly evolving. Actually, 2 years ago, the OIA published an addendum to the acrylamide listing. In this addendum, they were exempting companies from putting the warning if they were able to show that they were following Codex practices to reduce levels of acrylamide during cooking. So the Codex published some practices that companies could be following to reduce acrylamide formation. So they added this addendum, and they also established new limits for acrylamide in certain food categories: bread, nuts, potato chips, cookies, waffles. So maybe there is one or more. They have now new limits for acrylamide.
Gotcha. So you mentioned exemptions. And so how does that work? Because there are other exemptions, right? I believe there's one for chocolate, isn't there? Cocoa, I mean.
It's not really an exemption, it's more of a consent judgment. In terms of exemptions, companies that are exempt, they have less than 10 employees, or they are governmental agencies, and companies that can prove that a hazard is naturally occurring, and that's the case of cocoa to some extent, as well as companies that have a chemical, but it's below the safe harbor level, they are exempt from having the warning on the labels.
Right. And that's what companies really want, is they don't want to have that warning on the label. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, that's
the point. So the other piece of this as well is there's an interesting mechanism at work here from the legal side as well, is, as I understand it, Anna, essentially law firms are incentivized to do this, aren't they?
Well, yes. I think when we talk about Prop 65, it's important to mention that it is dominated by a very small group of plaintiff attorneys whose practice consists of extracting settlements from these companies. So these plaintiff attorneys, as well as other private law enforcers, they can take samples from the marketplace and send out for testing. And if they find, in the case of chemicals with safe harbor level, that levels are above that, then they can send a notice of violation to these companies.
Right. And as I understand it as well, then when a settlement is reached, because a lot of times this is what happens in these type of situations, the company has to pay a fine, the state gets part of the money, and the law firm gets part of the money, right? So they're out there actively looking, and to your point, they're going to grocery stores and they're just pulling product off of the grocery store shelves and sending them out for testing, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And, there are many laboratories that specialize in Prop 65 testing, but really, like, in terms of heavy metals, any laboratory today offers heavy metal testing. So it's pretty easy to do it.
So the bottom line is, as a company, you need to protect yourself, and you need to understand this so that if you get a communication from a lawyer, that you can say, no, here's our testing results. And this kind of gets into what Raphael, his comment here. So I wanted to kind of overlay these. So in California, I remember a string cheese case, the package had the right weight, but one of the 10 fingers of the package had lower weight than the 10th average weight of the package, and they got a huge fine. So the reason this is important, and so in the dairy industry, I think at some point in the future I should do a show on labeling. And I worked for a company that made string cheese, and on the package it said contains 8 ounces of string cheese, 1 ounce pieces. That second part, and so the lawsuit that Raphael's talking about here is different than what we did. We weren't involved in this lawsuit, but I saw that and I looked at our packaging. Because it said 1 ounce each, that changes the labeling weight requirements under the weights and measures laws. So instead of having a package that weighed 8 ounce, I had 8 individual pieces of cheese that weighed 1 ounce each, which means if you have a deviation on your maximum allowable variation, it's on the 1 ounce instead of the 8 ounce, and you can't use lot averaging. So it puts you in a much tighter box. And we were able to change our labeling with our marketing group and get around that. And the reason that's important, and this segues into what we're talking about here, Anna, is you need to understand that from your perspective, from the testing results as well, because the lawyers are going out and pulling a random sample from the shelf. And for that particular lot code that you manufactured, you're going to have some variance of these particular chemicals within that lot. So some may be a little higher, some may be a little lower relative to the compliance limits. But overall, that lot, is it within range?
Right.
And if you don't have that data in your hands, you're kind of at their mercy, aren't you?
Yes, and you don't want to have surprises, right? And that's why it is so important to know where you are related to heavy metals, especially.
Yeah, exactly. So Austin had a question here for you. He wanted to know, so you can lower the acrylamide by changing cooking practices?
According to the Codex, yes. There is a series of practices that the Codex published, and the OEA, the California office that manages Prop 65, makes reference to this practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I understand it, because in fast food, for example, and this is outside of my area of expertise, so I may be talking incorrectly here, but so for example, fast food restaurants, right, they want to get the food out fast. And one of the large sources of acrylamide are fried foods. And they would have, pretty high temperatures on their cooking oils for their French fries because you want to cook your French fries fast. So the higher the temperature, the more production of these acrylamide compounds from the carbohydrates in the French fries. So they've lowered their temperatures to produce less, which also means then it takes longer to cook the fries.
Absolutely.
So, Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. We got a wonderful group of people here today. So a big part of this, right? So we've kind of established the baseline here, Anna. We have these groups, we have these laws, we have lawyers, laboratories, the state of California, all these groups out there. So they're using these methodologies to determine compliance, and then they're contacting you. Mm-hmm. What should a company be doing to protect themselves in these situations to make sure that they're in compliance?
Sure. And I think we can talk about first, like what happens when, let's say, your company receives a notice of violation. What paths can companies take, right? So there are two main paths. The first one is to settle, and this is the most common path. It's the easiest, it's the cheapest. And just to provide some numbers here, last year only, there were more than 1,000 settlements. Wow. And the total dollar amount associated with this was over $40 million. So it's a lot of money. And it's not just paying the money to the plaintiff attorneys. There are affirmative actions that companies need to take to comply with the settlements. For example, agreeing to reformulating the products, adding the warnings to their labels, and so on. So even this is not very straightforward. The other path is to defend yourself in court. And this, as you can imagine, very expensive with attorney fees, toxicologists, and so on. And when companies decide to take this path, usually they will make two arguments. The first one, they will show that actually, to your point, Bryan, their product on average typically is meeting safe harbor levels. Mm-hmm. Or they will challenge the safe harbor level because Prop 65, different from other regulations, that is like ppm, right? Parts per million, parts per billion in the product is based on micrograms per day. Mm. But what is per day, right? Is it one serving? Is it two servings? Or is it less than one serving per day? So in 2013, there was a consent judgment. So that was a result of a notice of violation to a company that makes protein shakes. And what they did, what the defendant did, is they showed that the typical consumer of their products was not having the shake every single day. They were having the shake after a workout, so once every 3 days. And with this, their limits in the product could be higher. So that's one way of looking at it. The other path, the other argument that companies will make when defending themselves in court is that the chemical is naturally occurring. So naturally occurring chemicals are exempt from Prop 65. but it's very hard to make a case that a chemical is naturally occurring, right? Because if we think about, factories burning coal, they are releasing mercury in the atmosphere. This mercury comes back to our oceans and contaminate our seafood. This is a result of human activity, human pollution. But there is one successful case related to that, and you mentioned before that was the cocoa and chocolate industry. There was an also violation sent to Trader Joe's, and as a result, there was a consent judgment that was signed a few years ago, and that was with many of the biggest players in the coffee and chocolate industry. So Barry Callebaut, Guitar, Lind, Mars, the big names were there. Hershey's was there. The biggest names signed it into this consent judgment, and they were able to prove that lead and cadmium are naturally occurring in cocoa. And as a result of this agreement, new limits were established for cocoa and chocolate products. And this is based on the amount of cacao present in the product. These limits apply only to the companies that sign it into the consent judgment. But here's the thing. If your company is buying cocoa or chocolate to manufacture your finished products, and you're buying from one of these companies that signed it into the agreement, you can benefit from this as well. So to close the loop, if your company receives an also violation, these are the two paths that companies will take, either to settle or to defend themselves in court.
Gotcha. So really, and you hit on something I think that's really important here for people to understand, Anna, is we're used to, in chemistry and food safety, looking at things in parts per million generally, right? When you start going into serving size, this gets very confusing, doesn't it? Because a serving size for me is very different from a 5-year-old child, right?
Yes, and most attorneys that I spoke with will consider, in terms of Prop 65, they will consider one serving equals to the exposure per day. But this is something that I think every company should discuss with their counsel, because it really changes completely your limits in the product. Right. So it's something that you need to define. It's an important business decision. It will dictate how much, in terms of heavy metals, how much heavy metals you can have in your product.
Right. Well, and these things can really cascade, because recently, Anna, we saw an example of some baby food in pouches that was tested, and the cinnamon was found to have high levels of heavy metal. And FDA then started looking very closely at cinnamon. And as a result of that, over the past 6 months or so, we have had a cascade of cinnamon that's being recalled. And I post these in the locals group, and I'll put this here later, the link in for the free locals group. But the amount of cinnamon recalls we've been seeing is huge. And so even though you may not be directly involved, now all of a sudden you are. So let's say, for example, you're using a very small amount of cinnamon in your product, but because of these recalls cascading from the Apple products with the cinnamon for the children, now that's being recalled, and now all of a sudden you've got a recall on your product because of a minor ingredient, even though you're still well below limits.
Yeah, and that's an interesting case to mention here. This recall, I think it was a sad event, and it's very different from anything else that we're talking here. It was a criminal act, and a perfect example of economically motivated adulteration. Right. So what happened is, a company in Ecuador was selling cinnamon powder. They added lead chromate to their powder to improve the color, to increase the weight. And they sold the cinnamon to many companies, including companies that were manufacturing foods for babies and toddlers, which are the most vulnerable population in terms of heavy metals, because it will have serious effects to their brain development. And just to put things in perspective, when the FDA took samples of the cinnamon, the levels of lead were between 2,000 and 5,000 ppm. So this is a lot. And for the fruit pouches that were recalled, the limits were between 2 to 6 ppm. To put in perspective, Bryan, the FDA is taking many measures, many actions to reduce heavy metals in foods for babies and toddlers. The FDA Baby Food Act is there for this reason. And the limits, they have a draft guidance with limits for lead only. The limits found in these fruit pouches are 200 times higher than the limits that the FDA wants to implement for baby foods. So this is how high it was. And this is why dozens of kids ended up hospitalized.
Wow, that's crazy. And so part of this, and Cortland reminded me of this as well, is these limits aren't static, right? They're going down. California actively lowers a lot of these limits as well, don't they? And they're pushing it into other areas.
And I think I like Cortland's comments here that these limits are being pushed to water. So water is one of the items that the FDA has limits. And if we were to compare the limits that the FDA has for water with Prop 65, depending on your serving size, you might end up needing to be lower than that.
Wow. Well, and that's a good point, right? Because even trying to figure out in some situations, compliance is difficult because a lot of times you have to refer, like in water products, for example, to EPA relative to some of these standards, and those kind of piggybacking on each other, and that gets really complicated. But not our topic for today, because part of this as well, and everybody's been paying close attention to this, I'll just kind of throw this in here for fun, is the recent ruling with the Supreme Court called Chevron, where essentially the Supreme Court has said regulatory agencies cannot push beyond their limits relative to the standards. They can't write law, essentially, is what FD had said in these areas. And so I attended a webinar yesterday from Hogan Lovells where they were talking about this. And a key point on this, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out with these laws relative to California as well, is that the key takeaway from the conversation I got was that existing laws stay in place, that existing regulations, stay in place. If they're challenged, so this kind of parallels Prop 65, if they're challenged, they could potentially be overturned under Chevron Hooper. And within that, then these could be changed over time. But if they're there and no one challenges them, they're still in place. So I think there's definitely some overlap with Prop 65 on that. So on the legal side, you wouldn't think that food safety would be this impacted by regulatory activity, but it is. It definitely is for sure. We're seeing that with that as well. So, okay, Anna, let's say that you're in a food company and you're responsible for making sure that the company is compliant for these type of activities. What type of a program or process would you put in place to do this?
Well, yeah. So I think the first thing is awareness, right? So companies, if you're selling in California, you need to be aware of this regulation. You need to understand this regulation, but also not do it by yourself. You definitely want to talk with your company's attorney. And to me, to my perspective, there are three things that I need to know in my Prop 65 plan. The first one is my raw materials. So I want to know what are the levels of heavy metals in my raw ingredients by testing, by reaching out to suppliers and asking for their test reports. The other thing, my formula, I need to know the usage rate of each of these ingredients in my formula. And finally, we already touched on that, is the serving size or the exposure per day, which is something that every single company should discuss with their attorney. Once you have these three pieces of information, then you can calculate your theoretical exposure. And this is how I like to approach it. So I have a spreadsheet for each of my formulas, and I have all of my ingredients. I have the usage rate of each of these ingredients. and I know what is the minimum, maximum average for them in terms of heavy metals. And once I have this information, I can calculate what is the theoretical levels of heavy metals in my formula, and then I can identify risks. Once you have this calculator in place, it's very easy to tweak. Let's say you want to approve a new ingredient, a new supplier, or you want to increase the usage level of an ingredient. This becomes very, very easy to do. And then, yes, and then you can start identifying, what are your high-risk ingredients, what are your low-risk ingredients, and you will be surprised with what you find. One might think that, sugar or vegetable oils usually are used at high levels, would be a high-risk ingredient, but refined sugar, usually very low. Refined vegetable oils, I never tested one that was above the limit of quantification. But then you are surprised with ingredients that you were not thinking would be high risk. You test and boom, it comes with high levels, and even at a low usage rate, it might have an impact into the total levels of your finished formula.
Right. So you have to look at this as an accumulated total in your formulation and then compare that to the serving size or the target audience of who you're selling to in the food industry.
Yes, correct.
Gotcha.
And validate, right? After you do your theoretical calculations, validate in finished products. Use caution to do that. But yeah, I think that's a good way of approaching.
Okay, so I'll be devil's advocate and say, okay, well, Anna, I'm buying from these wonderful suppliers in my food company, and they give me COAs once a year. That's good enough, right?
Well, typically no, and that's something that comes all the time. Whenever supply chain product development wants a new ingredient to be approved, they will come with a spec sheet and ask if that is good enough. And I'll say, I don't know, because usually spec sheets will have very high limits, and they are built in a way that every lot will pass. And many suppliers will use that to produce their COA. So to your point, many suppliers will report the results as below the spec limit, which is very high for Prop 65. So yeah, that does not suffice. I always like to look at typical levels by testing the ingredient itself. And, even when suppliers have high limits in their spec sheet or provide the COAs, again, just showing below the spec limit, ask your supplier for the actual test reports. And you will find that many times they are open to it, and you will find more useful information there.
Right. Well, and part of this is they want to sell you something. So of course, they want to have data that's going to satisfy you. So there's a conflict of interest there. Plus, they may not understand. Right. Let's say that you're buying from a supplier in Southeast Asia, and they don't understand the laws and the regulations associated with these products, and they may be taking a sample once a year because testing's expensive. And did they get a good sample? Is it a representative sample? If you're just testing once a year and you're pulling a 25-gram sample out of your entire production for that year, that's pretty much worthless, isn't it?
That's a very good point, Bryan. And I think we need to remind folks that suppliers, they don't need to comply with Prop 65 because they are not selling directly to consumers. So many times you need to educate them and let them know that, hey, we as finished product manufacturers, we need to comply with this. And this is how low we need to be in our finished products. And many times they will be surprised by the limits that you need to have in the ingredient itself.
Yeah, and if you do get hauled into court under this and you decide to defend yourself, the defense of, well, my supplier said it was good, you're going to get laughed at in the court case for sure. Cortland runs a lab, so his input's always really good. So most suppliers skip lot tests, therefore they may test 1 in 1,000. Yees, right? So there's always a golden rule: is trust but verify.
Yeah.
And the other key point of this, right, is you need this baseline information, and I'll get to Raphael's comment here as well in just a second, but marketing, right? This is very important to have this information for marketing. So let's say that you're producing a chocolate drink, and marketing comes and says, oh, we want to release a new product, the super duper triple chocolate fudge drink. And they think it's amazing and it's going to sell really well. Whoa, cocoa is a major contributor to these type of elements, lead, for example. So you need to understand these calculations so that you understand that limit on those consumptions, right?
Right. And then if you are using cocoa and your supplier sign into the consent judgment that we just mentioned, you could deduct the contributing lead coming from cocoa from your formula. So yeah, this is a resource that you could use.
Yep.
And just to close on Cortland's comment, many times we are working with raw agricultural commodities, and every crop will test a little different than the previous. So 1 in 1,000, definitely not enough.
Well, and so Raphael, I think, is making a good point here as well, is when you're setting up these formulas and your evaluation of these products, don't run the ragged edge, right? Oh, here's my limit for my servings relative to heavy metals. You need to have a little bit of room in that. You don't want to be right at the limit because you're going to have variability associated with that limit. So you're putting yourself at risk potentially, and your company as well, right?
Absolutely, yes. I like to look at these as minimum, maximum, and average. And my goal is to always be under Prop 65. I know many attorneys will treat these as on average. You need to be able to show that your products meet Prop 65, but it is understandable that some variation will happen coming from ingredients.
Yeah, so there's variation in the crops, the sampling, the testing, the lab equipment. And we're seeing with chemistry testing equipment, I'm sure Cortland can comment on this as well, is we used to report values in parts per million. Now, as you said earlier, Anna, we're getting values in parts per billion, right? So we're getting a lot more resolution into what's actually present in these type of materials. You need to understand that. Another key point that you made that I want to make sure is put here as well is don't say to yourself, if you're in a food company and say, oh, Anna's been talking about, having lawyers and, oh, we've got a lawyer. No, what we're talking about here are specialized lawyers, law firms that deal in Prop 65 compliance and understand all these nuances. So having that outside expertise that you can talk to is extremely important, isn't it?
Absolutely, Bryan. Companies definitely need to talk with a lawyer that specializes in Prop 65 to identify any risks. And to your point, work with a reliable laboratory. The limits that you need to achieve to show compliance with Prop 65 are extremely low. And some of the laboratories are not even there in terms of limit of quantification. So definitely understand what should be your daily exposure, where your levels need to be, and then talk with your laboratories and ask about their limits of quantification to see if this laboratory will be a good fit for your business.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely, because part of this, right, and we talked about this earlier, is we have this whole system set up in California. You have these lawyers that are going out and doing this, and they have specific labs that they deal with for the testing. You also need to do your research in advance as well and make sure that you find and identify laboratories that do this type of testing and understand what you're trying to do here as well. Because just going to a generic lab and saying, hey, can you evaluate my product for lead? May not be enough, right? They may not understand exactly what you need, right?
Right, yes. And they might report the results with a limit of quantification that will not really be helpful in your case.
Exactly. So you had pulled up some information here from a firm. Did you want to take a look at that now, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think now would be a good time. And in terms of, and this is related to the products that are being more targeted for Prop 65. I think a good resource. So this is actually from Keller and Hackman, It is a law firm that specializes in many things, including Prop 65. And they have what they call Prop 65 posts. You can go to their website and subscribe, and you will receive monthly reports with any violations that were received in the prior month. So that's a good way of being updated on what's currently hot in terms of Prop 65. This report is from the month of July. And if you scroll down, Bryan,
Okay.
what we see there.
Wrong sheet. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Can you see
What
it?
we see there, so a lot of heavy metals, right? And the products that received more violations last month, dietary supplement. And here it includes protein powders, protein shakes, herbal supplements, seafood, always high risk, right? So there were 24 notices for seafood, fruits and vegetables, snack foods. An interesting thing is acrylamide. That's the first time that I see notices in the last 12 months. So I think acrylamide notices of violation are back. And now with some modifications like the ones that I mentioned before, the addendum that Prop 65 added to acrylamide listing with new levels to certain food category. PFOA, yes, fun fact here, PFOA, the limits, the safe harbor levels are so low that even on their website, Prop 65 needs that. You need to be always below the limit of quantification.
Wow. Very interesting. And so I put that link in there for that. And this definitely syncs up here with what Cortland was saying as well, which is watch Dateline's lab expose on dietary supplements. Yeah, because a lot of times, and we saw this for the TerraFlower recall, right? Unknown ingredients. So a lot of times, especially in dietary supplements, you have all these superfoods and all these type of things, and they're ground up whatever, and you don't necessarily know. And these things are being tested, and you can really get caught.
Absolutely.
Steve had a question for you here, Anna. What about other states like Maine that have unique restrictions on chemicals?
On Maine and PFAs, I am not versed on that, so I can't comment. In terms, I think in terms of heavy metals, there are a couple of laws that go together with Prop 65. But I can't comment on PFAs.
Well, and I think this goes to highlight as well why it's important to have a law firm that you can talk with who does keep track of all of this stuff for you. So, for example, school lunch programs, a lot of times, right? California is looking at making some changes relative to the requirements for ingredients and additives in the school lunch program. So I know that they're looking at colors and things like this out there. So if you're not keeping track of all this stuff, because this is constantly changing, you need people out there who keeping track of this for you, right? Because just like we're talking here with Prop 65, these things can bite you really fast, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And on that note, I mean, that was a great segue, Steve. Thank you very much. Is what type of things do you see out there, Anna, that are coming down the pike that you're worried about?
Well, I touched on this a little bit related to heavy metals. The Baby Food Act is coming, and this was a result. In 2021, the FDA tested several samples of baby foods, and the results for heavy metals were alarming. So as a result, the FDA is taking several actions to, one, reduce heavy metals in foods for babies and toddlers, and two, to establish limits for heavy metals in these food items. And they already released the draft guidance for lead, and the final guidance is going to be released at the end of this year. If they keep the limits as it's in the draft, is going to be 0.01 to 0.02 ppm for lead in baby foods.
And that's per serving, or like you were talking about?
It's just, no. This
Total.
is going to be just ppm. ppm, so parts per million. And that's an interesting point because, let's say, to keep it simple, if you have a food that has 100 milliliter, 100 gram serving, right, and you have 0.01 ppm, what does it mean in terms of micrograms per serving? If you consider one serving equals to the daily exposure, it equals 1 micrograms per serving, which is already twice the limit for Prop 65. So Prop 65 remains being the most strict regulation out there. And in the end of the year, the FDA will release a draft guidance for cadmium and arsenic. So we'll see what these limits will be, a lot coming. And it's still related to new laws. California has now the AB 899. So this is another right to know law. It was enacted last year. And this one, basically what it does is it requires manufacturers of foods for babies and toddlers to test their products and to release the results on their website. This year, these manufacturers are already required to test, and starting next year, they will be required to release the results on their website. And yes, Corson, to your point, Prop 65 is still tighter. So
yeah, well, and part of this too, this almost becomes a competition between different states, right? They see what California's doing. It's like, okay, well, we'll follow on what they're doing, and maybe we'll make it a little bit tighter to show that we're better than they are, right? So you need to keep track of these as well too. Wow, ton to keep track of, right? And I think this kind of the overall framework that we're following here follows what we generally do in food safety with your food safety plan and everything else. It's just that now, instead of just looking at the micro stuff that we do, we need to look at the chemistry and the components here associated with these regulations and understand what's reasonably likely to occur and put a game plan in place to protect your company on these type of hazards. Through all of this conversation, the agencies aren't saying zero, right? They understand that that's not even possible. But you need to minimize that risk, and that needs to be part of your conversation and your strategy relative to these programs as well. So anytime that you are modifying or changing, just like in your food safety plan on it, you need to reevaluate. So if the procurement group says, oh, hey, we just found this amazing new source of an ingredient at a fantastic price, we need to start using this right away, we need to do our evaluations first. Right? We need to understand if it's going to meet the same requirements and the same safety levels that our current ingredients do. And the organization needs to understand this. So a lot of times as we talk here on the chat, it's very, very important, especially with this type of complicated, esoteric, very detailed process that we need to go through, that the other groups in the organization understand what's going on, so that the marketing group understands if they're making claims and they want to have this triple chocolate fudge product, how it's going to impact this. Or other groups within the company, the procurement group like we talked about, or R&D. If R&D is starting to make products and ideas that they're playing with, they need to understand, Anna was talking with me about this. I need to understand that there's particular ingredients that may be more riskier than others. And so how do you communicate this within the organization to other groups?
Yeah, I think this should be part, if your company goes through a stage gate, this should be part of your stage gate, right? I think there should be an early QA risk assessment of any new products. And if you see that a new product or a new ingredient, a new supplier would put your product at risk, you definitely want to let your leadership team know, because they also don't want to be surprised, right, by receiving a notice of violation.
Yes, that's no one likes to be surprised, because the last thing you want if you're working in food safety and you're responsible for these type of activities is all of a sudden a letter shows up, you're being fined, the state of California is going to make you label your products as a cancer risk, and now all of a sudden the CEO is in front of you and saying, what is all this stuff? And if your answer is, I don't know, you're in for a bumpy year.
Yeah, and I think Prop 65, there is the regulatory risk, but there is the brand risk. Yes. There are several consumer groups just taking samples from the market testing for heavy metals, you name it, and posting the results on their websites, right? So even if for any reason you were able to, through a consent judgment, for example, be in compliance and not having the warning on your product, the results are still there. And when they release these reports, they are always comparing the levels found against Prop 65, which is the strictest regulation. So very important to be in compliance.
That's a good point, right? So let's kind of bring this back up to the 50,000 foot level for everybody. Anna, what would you like everybody to take away from our conversation here today?
Well, Prop 65 is here to stay, right? And if you were selling in California, you need to be aware of this regulation. You want to avoid surprises. So I think to wrap up and summarize, know what is currently being targeted. Here we spoke about the Keller and Hackman Prop 65 posts. I'm sure there are other tools right there that folks can use to be up to date on what's happening in this constantly changing space. Know where you are. So test your ingredients, test your products, identify risks. If you see that an ingredient is a risk to your product, work to reformulate, right? There are ways of reducing levels through reformulation, through approving alternative suppliers. And always keep your leadership team informed of the risks that you identify. And just to close, I think the biggest question that companies need to ask themselves is it feasible to meet Prop 65 limits? Because the answer might be no. And then the safest thing to do is probably to just add the warning to your label.
Right. No, I agree. Because to your point, and that's a really good one, and Raphael's talking about this as well. Great comments today, Raphael. Thank you. Is that like most of the things, right? Don't keep this bottled in. The organization needs to understand the risk because, okay, fine, you get hauled into court or whatever, and you pay a fine, $20,000, $30,000. That's not the biggest problem. It's the damage to your brand.
To the brand, yeah.
So now all of a sudden you're on websites and you're being listed, and people are writing editorials and YouTube videos of, oh, don't eat this product. It's full of contaminants and it's bad for you. And the damage to your brand can be absolutely devastating, and you don't want to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. So everybody, I put a link in here for the locals group. Again, it's free, and I put information in here. And so I'll be putting in here a little bit of information on our show here today, and some of the sources with Keller Heckman, which is a fantastic law firm. They do a great job. I've worked with them in the past. They do a wonderful job in this area. Reach out and start putting your game plan together on this, because like most of the things in food safety that we're dealing with is it's the stuff that you don't know about that gets you. So knowledge is power here.
Yes, and I think just to close the conversation, I think there are pros and cons, right? I think to some extent, Prop 65 pushes the industry to do better, and there are ways of reducing these chemicals in our products. On the other hand, keep in mind, these safe harbor levels for Prop 65 compliance are extremely low. So they use a very, very high safety margin, which makes very difficult for companies to comply with and leave companies in a very vulnerable position.
Yep. So we're back to quality basics again. Plan, do, check, act, right? You have to have these programs in place and have systems and mechanisms in place to course correct to get you back on course. So with that, guys, we're going to bring our chat to a close here again for this week. Thank you, Anna. Fantastic conversation. This is an extremely complex topic, and you did an amazing job of making it easy to understand. So thank you.
Thank you for the invite, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone, for the great comments.
Yes, I mean, yeah, we got tons of great comments. And again, right, we do this for you guys. And this participation is the thing I enjoy the most with the chat, is people getting together and sharing information and expertise within this space. So next week, we'll be on the Food Safety Chat again at the same time. Next Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll bring another amazing food safety expert like Anna onto the chat to have a conversation with you. So in the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Have a great time. Enjoy all the wonderful weather that you're having in this fall season. Great time of year. So we'll see you back here next week. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you. Obrigada.